Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ed Sivak, and I am the Chief Policy and Communications Officer here at HOPE. We would like to start by thanking you for joining us today for the Deep South Economic Mobility Forecast. We are thrilled to have the former administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration, Karen Mills, with us today. She will be joined by HOPE CEO Bill Bynum, and they will discuss ways to promote economic mobility, particularly for the communities hardest hit by the pandemic. We are also joined by the director of the HOPE Policy Institute, Diane Standard, and policy analyst Kiad Burt, who will start the conversation with a brief overview of labor market, small business, and recovery trends in our region. To maximize our time together, we have posted all of the speaker bios along with the slides shared today on the landing page for the Deep South Economic Mobility Forecast. These are available at hopecu.org/mobilityforecast. And before we begin, we just have two quick housekeeping items. First, we encourage attendees to ask questions via the Q&A or chat features. Please direct all questions to the host. Bill and Karen will address attendee questions during the second half of the conversation. Second, with WebEx, there is a feature available in the upper right-hand corner of the screen titled Layout. If you click on that feature and scroll down, there's an option to hide participants who are not on camera. This will focus the frame on the speakers throughout the webinar. With that, I'm excited to turn the event over to my colleague, Diane Standard.
Thank you, Ed. To get started, it's important to, as we plot a path forward, it's important to understand and to know where we have been. Prior to COVID-19, Deep South communities were already dealing with the pre-existing crises of racial and economic inequality. So now this triple threat of crises is the convergence of centuries of policies and practices that extract, discriminate, and underinvest in Deep South people and communities. The disparities we'll discuss today are the product of this legacy. But at the same time, decisions we are making today about the path to recovery is an opportunity to break rather than to repeat this cycle of inequality. And while there are many factors at play, we'll primarily focus on labor market changes and small businesses today, as well as the shortcomings of already enacted relief efforts. And as you'll see, there's a shared history and shared demographics that uniquely defines the Deep South as a region, but there are also differences within the states, such as the Mississippi Delta and Alabama Black Belt, that need to be recognized and considered as well. So here you can see just one manifestation of the pre-COVID financial vulnerabilities as measured by liquid asset poverty. This simply means a lack of cushion in the face of an unexpected income loss. The percentage of families without a cushion in the Deep South is greater than the national average, and the racial disparities are striking, with over 60% of Black and Latino families lacking a cushion compared to over 40% of white families. This is the reality people were living prior to COVID-19, and the households with the least amount of cushion were the same ones that were hardest hit by both the public health and economic impact of COVID-19. Next slide. So here we can see this in looking at the changes of unemployment levels before and during the pandemic. So even though by 2019, Black employment levels had largely returned to those that existed prior to the Great Recession, the disparities were still quite vast, as you can see by the rose-colored bars. When COVID-19 struck, unemployment skyrocketed, particularly for Black and Latino workers, as shown by the red bars, such that now in places like Mississippi and Tennessee, there's now nearly 12% Black unemployment rate. And to put the scale of these job losses in context of the Great Recession, as of January 2021, more than 4.1 million people had filed for unemployment in the Deep South. By comparison, during the 2 years of the Great Recession, the Deep South lost 500,000 jobs. Next slide. So what lessons does the Great Recession provide us about the trajectory of recovery for this crisis? As you can see here, 3 Delta states in our region, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Alabama, took significantly longer to recover than the US as a whole. Mississippi, for example, didn't recover until a full decade later, until October 2019. So the decisions that we and policymakers make today can help tell a different story in recovery from this crisis. One change will need to be a significant and robust investment into small businesses, particularly those owned by people of color. This will be critical to the recovery of both the lost jobs and the economic vitality of the region as a whole. A recent study has shown that if following the Great Recession, if new small business growth had remained constant instead of falling, the economy would have recovered 4 to 6 years earlier, and the unemployment rate would have been 0.5 percentage point lower even 10 years later. Next slide. So these conversations of investing in small business growth and recovering the unemployment rate, they're interdependent. This is just one example to show that the need for support and the potential for new jobs is great among the smallest businesses, both in terms of where the losses occurred, but also to ensure a diverse and vibrant economy that really supports the entrepreneurial spirit of people across the Deep South. This is rather than a strategy focused on the consolidation of low-paying jobs among just a few corporations. Next slide. Finally, just one additional point about pre-existing COVID conditions is debt. These pre-existing debt loads shorten the reach of economic recovery efforts, either by having relief funds go towards predatory debt payments or leading to damaged credit scores that will serve as barriers to housing, to credit, to jobs for years to come, or even serving as a barrier to reaching the relief funds at all, such as how we saw a provision in the Paycheck Protection Program that barred access to small business relief for those who were delinquent on their federal student loans. We're thankful that change is coming. This slide also just articulates the massive amount of debt overhang in the South and imagines what else might be possible if people were paying this money towards something like small business startups rather than extractive debt mechanisms, and also underscores the importance of including strategies beyond just access to capital, but also grants and broad-scale debt forgiveness to ensure our region can recover. So to talk more about the importance of minority-owned businesses and what is needed to support their recovery in the Deep South, I will now turn it over to my colleague, Kiad Berg.
Thank you, Diane. Small businesses are the backbone of local economies across this country. They account for 44% of U.S. economic activity. For communities of color, small businesses are equally important. Black and Latino-owned businesses employed over 7 million people prior to the pandemic. However, for many minority-owned businesses, their impact is greatly stifled by challenges in access to capital and affordable financial services. The Federal Reserve finds in a small business credit survey that minority-owned businesses are less likely to have a relationship with mainstream financial institutions like banks when compared to white-owned businesses. They showed that less than a quarter of Black-owned businesses have accessed credit from a bank in the 5 years prior to 2020, while 46% of white-owned businesses have accessed credit through a bank over the same period of time. This lack and disparity in access translates to issues with creating capital reserves to sustain an economic downturn. In a survey sample of our Paycheck Protection Program borrowers, we see the impact of this financial exclusion. Most businesses were unprepared for the challenges of the pandemic, and yet the depth of preparedness unsurprisingly differs by race. 71% of Black-owned businesses that received a PPP loan were white-owned businesses, as compared to 47% Black-owned businesses and 47% of white-owned businesses. Let me repeat, sorry. Most businesses were unprepared for the challenge of the pandemic, and yet the depth of preparedness unsurprisingly differs by race. 71% of Black-owned businesses that received a PPP loan were unprepared, as compared to 47% of white-owned businesses. Businesses of color have been historically excluded from financial institutions, so we see that these businesses are less well-positioned to confront the challenges of the pandemic. Next slide, please. But who are these businesses that have been systemically excluded and underserved? The majority of these businesses are non-employers. Non-employers can be nail techs, barbers, real estate agents. They can provide pet care, and they can do other related work. They represent a sector of businesses that offer ease of entry and flexibility for many Americans. They are a crucial element to any solution of economic recovery, given that 4 in 5 businesses in the nation are non-employers. Also at the national level, over 90% of Black and Latino-owned businesses are non-employers. And as you can see here, similar trends exist in the Deep South, with the majority of businesses being non-employers and businesses of color showing a higher percentage of non-employers firms than white-owned businesses. Next slide, please. Given their abundance, minority non-employers are significant economic drivers in the Deep South, yet disparities exist not just in percentage of total firms, but also in revenue generated. White-owned non-employer firms account for 83% of total revenue generated by non-employers, yet constitute only 74% of all non-employers. Conversely, Black-owned non-employers represent 17% of revenue generated and 26% of all non-employers in the Deep South. Simply, white-owned businesses have a disproportionate share of revenue. If Black-owned non-employers were to have their proportionate share of revenue, that would be an additional $10 billion in revenue generated. This underscores the need for additional access to capital and investment into small businesses of color. Now, disparities persist for these businesses even during the pandemic. For instance, non-employers were locked out of the first 7 days of the Paycheck Protection Program. By the time they received access, hundreds of billions of dollars had already been allocated to other businesses. Additionally, when they gained access, they could not get the max benefit of the program. Due to the program's design, non-employers would often receive low loan amounts or not qualify for PPP altogether. Again, given that over 90% of Black and Latino businesses are non-employers, they were disproportionately harmed. Now, the White House has recently announced important changes to increase access and benefit for non-employers, yet the changes are not retroactive, meaning that for the majority of the PPP program, non-employers struggle to access hundreds of billions of dollars in small business relief. Now, next slide. Thanks. Businesses of color not only face challenges at the federal level, but they face challenges at the state level. For example, due to a racially discriminatory formula, white-owned businesses receive 90% of the Tennessee Small Business Relief Fund as funded by the CARES Act. Next slide. Despite these challenges the businesses face, CDFIs, especially minority-led CDFIs, are well positioned to meet their needs when other institutions cannot. Consider again the PPP. CDFIs in Mississippi and Louisiana, two states with the largest Black population in the country, made over 7 times the number of PPP loans as compared to the 5 largest banks in the United States. Next slide. When looking forward to recovery, small businesses have already expressed what is needed. We know that businesses hardest hit by the pandemic, particularly Black-owned businesses, will need additional capital support in the upcoming months to withstand the pandemic. This capital will be used primarily for payroll, but also for business expenses and business improvements to keep pace with the changing nature of service delivery and health regulations. So the data we have provided today shows the structural challenges that businesses of color face in striving for economic stability. It also speaks to the resilient nature of these businesses amidst the pandemic and the expertise and capacity of the institutions that serve them. So with that, I will turn it back to Ed.
Thank you, Kiad. We will now turn the conversation over to Bill and Karen. Again, if you have a question that you would like to ask, we ask that you please direct it through the Q&A or chat features. Bill?
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Diane and Kiad. There was a lot to digest. I'm so glad to kick off this conversation with my good friend, Karen Mills. Karen, thanks for being here.
You know, thank you for inviting me. What a pleasure. It's really nice to be in this environment and to be with the folks who have joined us here.
Well, I'm glad we have the opportunity to take advantage of your expertise. You know, in addition to being a public servant, an entrepreneur, an investor, an educator, I certainly consider you one of the country's leading minds when it comes to financing businesses, particularly smaller businesses that are unfortunately often left out of mainstream solutions. And so let's just jump in. Yesterday, Fed Chairman Powell told Congress that the economic recovery remains uneven and far from complete. This echoes remarks that he made back in February 2019 when we had the opportunity to host Chairman Powell in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, where he remarked on the importance of ensuring places like Itta Bena, Mississippi, and the people who live, work, and attend school there at Mississippi Valley State University, a historically Black college, can fully participate in the economic recovery. That was before COVID. None of us knew what was coming on the horizon. The slides that Diane and Kiad just shared underscore the concerns that the chairman expressed yesterday and back in 2019. There was a lot packed into those slides. I'd like to start today by just simply asking you for your reactions to the data and findings. And as you do that, Karen, I don't know if probably can't see over my right shoulder, there's a photo of when I think you and I first met. I was sitting next to you, and on the other side was Treasury Secretary Geithner, and to his left was President Obama. This was in 2019 in the Roosevelt Room of the White House during a meeting with community bankers, and the topic was helping businesses navigate the Great Recession. So talk a little bit about let's start by your reactions to the slides that Kiad and Diane presented.
Well, first of all, it was great to have you in that room, by the way, so many years ago. And I'm so pleased that you started out with a data-driven presentation with the slides, because the data is pretty stark. And I'm going to repeat some of the things that Kiad said so well with his charts. But I really want to point out 3 issues from this data that you presented. The first is that this COVID pandemic has been the worst situation for small businesses in my lifetime. And I've seen some bad ones, like the one where you and I were gathered in the Roosevelt Room. You know, it was bad in 2009, but this is actually far worse for a whole lot of reasons. And why do we care? Why is this important? Because half of the people who work in this country own or work for a small business. That's half of America's jobs. And most importantly, it is the path to economic opportunity. This is the American dream. And all of a sudden we have, a real impediment to the health and well-being of these businesses. And of the 30 million small businesses, 24 million are sole proprietorships, and Black-owned businesses and all minority-owned businesses over-index in those very small businesses. So that brings me to the second point, which you made so eloquently in the slides. These barriers and frictions and systemic problems have really been long existing. And they are, really especially true in access to capital, because banking relationships have not been evenly distributed. So that brings me to the third point, which is this was even more true in the relief efforts. And we saw, despite, great efforts by my former civil servants at the SBA, all the people on the ground, everybody was trying real hard, but, we had that first tranche of PPP go out disproportionately to the clients, the bigger clients of bigger banks. So we are now in a situation where, starting from behind, these Black-owned businesses, smaller businesses, are even more disadvantaged. And when I look at the numbers on the recovery, it makes me very, very concerned that we are going to, have a much greater failure rate in this group, despite the fact, that we got to be all hands on deck right now for the third tranche of the recovery. And I was pleased, by the way, with some of the modifications that went into effect right now, saying we're going to send the money to the smallest businesses, we're going to send it to CDFIs, we're going to reduce some of these restrictions on people with, criminal records. We're going to try to get this money into the hands of the business owners so that they can be bridged into a recovery, which will be challenging in itself.
You hit the nail on the head. It's certainly consistent with much of what we are seeing across the Deep South and many of the communities, probably all of the communities that we serve at Hope. And as I said, you and I first crossed paths after the Great Recession. And I remember one of the things that you and I worked on was starting the Community Advantage Program within SBA that open up that tool for more CDFIs. What are some of the lessons, the tools that we should be paying attention to from that experience that apply to the current realities?
One of the things that we saw in 2009, and that was a different crisis. It was a credit crisis, and the banks had stopped lending because they'd gotten overextended in mortgages. But we saw that we had credit frozen. The banks just stopped lending to small businesses.
Yeah.
And we are seeing that sadly again. So what I did back in the fall was take out the playbook that we had used and start, really making a lot of noise that we had to put some of the same provisions back. We have a program at the SBA where we can get money through Community Advantage into smaller banks and CDFIs. But the problem is, there are fees attached, and the guarantee rate was only 75%. What we did in 2009 is we raised that guarantee rate to 90%. And it was like, I call it the hockey stick that did happen, because banks looked at it and they said, you know what? If the government takes 90% of the risk, I'm going to start lending again. And that's the kind of switch on that we need right now. And we needed it to be distributed to more institutions, as many institutions as who are responsible lenders as we can get. And we eliminated all the fees. So we were able to put that provision that we were going to fund raising the guarantees to 90% into the bill that passed over Christmas. And I am hopeful that it will have the same positive effect. So if we can get through this crisis and start the recovery action, that's number one. But access to capital is only one of three pillars that we need. The other two are counseling and advice, and helping people with the top line, more sales through government contracting. And I think those are equally important and powerful tools that we've got to work on, because a lot of small businesses, you saw in the slide about preparedness, small businesses need somebody to walk them through this. I mean, this is not intuitive for many of these business owners. So you need on the ground counseling and advice is almost an insatiable demand, and you need it available in the community locally with a level of trust.
No, you make several important points there. This is certainly not a new crisis. We've seen this movie before. And the fact that the capital was frozen during the previous crisis mirrors much of what we have seen, as you said, during the first round of PPPs, the PPP program. It was CDFIs that certainly stepped up in the hardest hit communities. Here in our region, we saw that I forget the exact numbers, but most of the loans, maybe 85 times more loans below $150,000 was made by CDFIs than the largest banks. So we prioritize communities and businesses in a very different way. The SBA program works for some historically and some not so well. There was a report that will be released next week by the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, and they've allowed me to quote one of the data points over the past year, that only 1.2% of SBA loans, 7A loans in Arkansas went to Black-owned businesses. This is in a state with 16 to 17% Black population. So banks left to their own devices have not adequately closed those gaps. What are some things that you think we might be able to do to engage banks? I'm glad that CDFIs are getting more resources, but there's just not enough capital within the CDFI sector at this point to address the need. Are there other policy levers that you think would help open up capital by traditional lenders?
Well, Bill, I'm gonna be a little bit controversial because there's some things that I've been working on exactly this problem, because we have been, I'm a big fan of CDFIs and of the kind of work you do, and I'm sure I'm, you know, preaching to the converted when I say a lot of the things I just said about counseling and how you have to be hands-on in the community, because that's what CDFIs do. The problem is, how do you scale this? So I'm all for, you know, increasing the amount of money that goes to CDFIs and the number of CDFIs. My number is 10x, but, you know, I'm not in charge anymore, so I can say that. But even if we do 10x and put a lot more money out there on the ground, which I think we should do, we still have a very manual process. And part of the benefit of many of the folks on the ground is they're on the ground and they're helping. But the problem that I'm seeing is we got to solve this at scale. You can't just have a big federal program, as you said, like SBA, and have nobody implement it. And this is why Community Advantage, this program that you were so important in making happen, this is a program that allows community organizations that may or may not be banks or maybe CDFIs to lend with an SBA guarantee. Why is the SBA guarantee important? It lets you lend to somebody who doesn't meet the credit criteria of a bank, of the bank regulators. And we know at the SBA, most of the people who fall in that gap are women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses. They over-index. And why should we be lending to them? Because it turns out 95% of them pay back the loan. The loss rate at the SBA is under 5%. So you've got $100 billion in the SBA portfolio of good loans that would not have been made unless the government came up with this kind of credit support. And what does it cost taxpayers? Almost nothing. Because remember, the loss rate is 5% and you charge a fee, and by the time you get finished, it's pennies. So how do we make better use of that in regions like the Deep South, where the banks aren't lending to the Black-owned businesses? We don't have that connection. And there, I think we got to get creative. I think we've got to, creative sometimes is a bad word in financial regulation, but I think we got to push the envelope to get responsible lenders who will lend in the community alongside CDFIs to the very smallest businesses. And here I have some hope for technology. Now we have a whole new fintech revolution, and I've written a book on it. And there's there's no real consensus that this is good or bad for minority-owned businesses. The good side is we know that many of these people want small loans. And a bank is not going to make a $6,000 loan. But Square, that's their average loan size. They make $6,000 loans, and I'm told they way over index 2x in Black-owned businesses. So how can we make sure that we marry the benefits of technology, which allow you to efficiently make a small loan, which a sole proprietor might want, with the personal touch of a local community bank or CDFI? That's the challenge I'd like to see us work on. Not say these are fighting, but how are we going to marry? For instance, if you gave me a wish list, I would tell a technologist, you come up with the perfect automated loan technology, fintech technology, that can automate everything, that sucks up all the credit information from for a CDFI and allows that loan officer to be spend their time on a relationship rather than grabbing all the paper and the data and trying to fill out the spreadsheet to underwrite the loan. And that's the world we're coming to. We have to make sure it doesn't bypass people who are not naturally digital.
No, that's great. You just described one of the real distinguishing characteristics of CDFIs is that they, in addition to being intentional about finding and serving the most vulnerable people and places, the amount of time that they put into it is important. And to be able to do that in a more efficient way is critical. It's not easy, but it is certainly very, very important.
That's a scarce resource out there, is that connection they have with the business owner. So let's automate anything that could be automated that would take up their time, and let them put the judgment and then the advice on top.
Yeah, that's been critical to be able to get more very small businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program, but it also is a challenge because the businesses typically are not as ready to come to the table with great, very well organized information. And so that has created some challenges. We're hoping that the PPP program will be extended and allow more businesses time to get through the portal. But that's certainly it's certainly the case that CDFIs are helping the smaller businesses, many that didn't even get a call back from traditional banks in the earlier rounds of the program.
Exactly the case.
You talked about this being more than credit, support services, opening market opportunities, getting to scale. I mean, this is certainly an all hands on deck moment. I've heard you also talk about the need to leverage the assets of anchor institutions like government and universities while not losing focus on Main Street. Hope recently launched an initiative we call the Deep South Economic Mobility Collaborative, where we brought together the capabilities of 7 cities, 9 historically Black colleges and universities, Goldman Sachs, to provide capital and support services to help stabilize and strengthen the smallest businesses, with a particular emphasis on Black entrepreneurs. Are there examples that you've seen work where in similarly sized cities, where you access university, tech hubs, accelerators, and bring those resources to bear and make them accessible to the smallest businesses?
Well, Bill, you know this is a favorite subject of mine, which is that there's really many kinds of small businesses. It's very much heterogeneity is a big issue. One day it's a dry cleaner, the next day it's a parts supplier, the next day it's the next tech company that's going to be Google. And it turns out that these businesses, each of these businesses needs a different kind of economic development strategy. Yeah. And let me just divide it up into kind of Main Street businesses and the innovation businesses. In the whole country, of the 30 million small businesses, there's only about 200,000 businesses a year that are these high growth venture capital backed businesses. But it turns out they are the key to driving, the next Silicon Valley and the next Google. They're really important in the economy. So if you are in a community and you are trying to manage your small business and entrepreneurship portfolio, you've got to make a separate strategy for them. And what do they need? They need access to a different kind of capital. A bank is not going to lend to many of these because it's too much risk capital. So you need accelerators and venture funds and local, SBA has a program called SBICs. You need local hubs. I'm a big fan of business plan competitions. We just ran one for Black entrepreneurs. 2 students of mine actually started last year at Harvard Business School, a business plan competition just for Black tech entrepreneurs. And they thought maybe they'd get 100. They got 300 applicants, and they were able to unearth some fabulous companies. Well, doing that same kind of competition in a region. I think doesn't take a lot of money. I think they raised a couple $100,000 of prize money, but they gave a Black Tech Master Series. They gave some education and doing a whole ecosystem around accelerators and business plan competitions involving the universities and the local colleges. That's what creates sort of an economic innovation hub. At the same time, you want to do a whole set of things for your Main Street businesses, especially as we come out of this devastating time where they've been closed. The restaurants, the dry cleaners, the car repair operations. They need a different kind of capital, more of what we've been talking about. They need the banks to be lending. They need the counseling and advice. And I think we're going to have to run a different kind of program for them. I have an idea for them. If I can just go on one more minute. I call it Restart America. And this is, let's do a competition for filling that storefront that's boarded up on Main Street. And let's put $10,000 prize money in the hands of the local Main Street Association and let them run the competition. Let's run it locally. And you get some excitement, a bunch of entrepreneurs. $10,000 is enough for somebody to kind of buy that new fixtures and fittings and refrigerator to open the cafe. And let's get some of those storefronts back going again, because we're going to have a lot of failures and we cannot afford to have our towns and downtowns in these communities, deteriorate and not recover fast.
No, those are great points. And I need to follow up with you and see how we can maybe replicate the business plan competition strategy. There's a lot of untapped innovative capacity in this part of the country, particularly at some of the historically Black colleges. We've got brilliant minds there that I imagine can, we're not Silicon Valley or Boston or Austin. There's a lot of potential here, and I'd love to think with you about how we can tap into that. But at the same time,
I've never been to a place that I didn't see between the local college and university and the community, the entrepreneur community, that we didn't have a lot of talent. And I think it just needs to be, shown a little wind at their back.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I also appreciate the importance of balancing that with the Main Street businesses, the small businesses, the service and retail companies who have been hit so hard by this crisis. 40% of Black businesses not going to open again. And so many of them are in these hardest hit sectors, and they are disproportionately employing low mobility people who have the hardest time climbing the economic ladder. So it's a both and strategy, and I really do appreciate you emphasizing that point. We've talked a lot about how to get capital and tools into the businesses, but just as important as we stabilize and strengthen these businesses is preserving the assets. You were very involved as Dodd-Frank was being rolled out. One of the provisions in Dodd-Frank requires small business lenders to share data by race. I believe very strongly in that. We were part of the SBA of the recent review of Dodd-Frank 1071 that requires disclosure. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this. From my opinion, if you can't measure it, if you don't have the data and know who's lending to whom and who they're not lending to, it's hard to develop solutions. But I would love to, and quite honestly, I believe that should include fintech. I'd love to get your thoughts on those efforts.
Well, thank you so much for mentioning it. This is something I've been pushing hard for, and I say in the past, I'm the one who put Section 1071 into Dodd-Frank. And what is that? That is just a provision that says you have to count. And to your point, Bill, what gets measured gets done. And we have a big problem here. It was evident in the slides, but getting that data is tough. And I'm just, I'm just done with all the arguments against this. We have to start measuring where our loan originations go so we can measure our progress in closing these gaps. And if we can't do that, we can't build wealth, we can't deliver the American dream across, all Americans. And we must get on this. So I appreciate you mentioning that.
Well, thank you for making that point. I know you're not going back into government anytime soon, but hopefully they're paying attention to the points that you're making.
Well, it is the law. It's not like we're trying to get a law passed. It got passed. So it's just got to get done now.
No, that's right. CRA's been the law, fair housing's been the law, anti-redlining's been the law, but it's got to be enforced, and we've got to make sure that people adhere to these critical rules, particularly in a country that's becoming increasingly diverse. We're shooting ourselves in the foot by leaving so many people behind.
And we are losing our ability to be the America we want to be with access and opportunity for everybody. This is my story with my family coming as immigrants, and I grew up this way, and I just think we have a great gift in this country that we're squandering. We're not going to be as prosperous and innovative across the whole country unless we can have this kind of inclusive entrepreneurship as part, not the only solution, but it's part of what we can do to give access and opportunity.
Well, couldn't agree more. Before we jump into Q&A, I do want to take some time and and respond to some of the questions that our audience are putting forward. I'd like to ask you you shared several ideas, but if you can look into your crystal ball, maybe lift up one or two opportunities for small businesses on the horizon and one or two challenges that we need to make sure that we address.
Well, I'm flush with ideas, that I'd like to see happen. But we didn't talk yet about government contracting and contracting in general, just getting a little bit more opportunity for sales and revenue into the hands of Black-owned small businesses and other underserved markets. We found this at the federal government to be the most powerful small business program. It was $100 billion a year of money into the hands of small business like oxygen. And cost to the federal government was zero. In fact, they got better companies, more entrepreneurs. The small companies had less overhead. And so they sometimes got a cheaper price, and it was just win, win, win. So I always say we can do this at the state level. We can do this at the local level. And I ask everybody, this great company called Alignable, which is, full disclosure, I'm an investor in it, but it's a community of small business owners, has 6 million small business owners. And they have this thing that says #MyMoneyStaysLocal. And you've seen this a lot. We should all be spending our money in our mind. We should just take a look and say, I know it was convenient to click on Amazon, but maybe we want to make sure some large part of our money stays local. And so figuring out how to do this in the private sector, you and I talk to a lot of, kind of big company folks. How much of their money are they buying from suppliers in their community? How can they develop those suppliers? Not only have the sales, but maybe they should have supplier financing. Maybe they should have supplier education. Maybe they should make it a real partnership if they want the supplier to work with them and be part of their supply chain. They should invest in their supplier and have a long-term contract, a long-term relationship. So I think all of those things could be part of a bigger plan that is in addition to access to capital and on-the-ground counseling.
I think that's great. And I think there are great opportunities on the horizon as more resources get injected in the economy, whether it's government stimulus or just as the economy gets back on its feet, there's going to be infrastructure investments. There are going to be environmentally focused investments. And it would be an amazing opportunity to balance the scales and to unlock the potential in this country if more of those opportunities went to diverse businesses, not just the traditional ones that have been at the front of the line in the past, but it'll both help the country get stronger and in the economy, but it'll also help these communities that are so often on the outside looking in.
Yeah. And we have a pipeline issue, not in that there aren't any, but that they aren't visible. So we've got a supply and demand. The supply is over here. We know it because, we see these great businesses, and then the companies say, I can't find any businesses. So we have work to do to make the supply chain and the visibility. But once again, technology and on the ground things like supply chain fairs, raising up the level in the ecosystem of suppliers. We can do a lot in these things if we make them priorities.
Well, thank you, Karen. I'm going to bring Ed back in. I think he's going to help us navigate the Q&A.
Thanks, Bill. And I want to just thank all of our participants for sharing questions. We have close to 15 questions that have come in. I will do my best to group them so we get through them. The first one is around minority tech startups. What resources are out there by way of equity or below market rate loans? Just again, resources to support this important sector.
Well, once again, this is where I mentioned, sort of this model I like of the business plan competitions, because what we see is that it's at the very early stage in the seed money where we don't have enough resources. The very best are getting some looks from the VC community, but we need early stage money in business plan competitions, and it doesn't have to be a lot of money. Then we need some mentorship and accelerators like, Y Combinator, but for, what about for Black businesses in the Deep South? And have, it housed at one of the great universities or local colleges and bring in some expertise. So we got to get a pipeline where those things start to get visible, and then start to introduce them to the risk capital producers. SBICs are another way to get local equity funding.
Thanks, Karen. Another question that came in was around sole proprietorships. What recovery tools are most aligned and appropriate for sole proprietors, especially given the large concentration of sole proprietors among Black and Hispanic households?
I was very, very happy that sole proprietors were included in PPP. And that was a big deal that we got that done. Now, I know we had a week's delay. It was described, I think Dan said it in the beginning, and that did put them behind. And it was also true that it was very hard for them to find the documentation. But just the recognition that of the 30 million small businesses, 24 million have no employees. And disproportionately, that's Black-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses. We need to have low dollar amounts that are available to them. And we also need to have help and advice and start, creating policy. The two policy things I would do is, healthcare is a big issue for them. So this is why Obamacare was so important, because they could finally get insurance and go out on their own. And the other thing is just to start, counting and valuing them as part of the small business community. Census numbers only count employer businesses. And we need to really just start having a policy category for these contractors, especially as the gig economy goes. Yeah. This is growing.
That's absolutely true, and we've seen that pick up during this crisis. I'd also want to make sure that the participants know that, again, as Karen mentioned, sole proprietors certainly can access the PPP program. And there's a lot of advocacy that went into making that happen. Diane and her team and others across the country played a critical role in bringing data from businesses that we saw in our PPP, apply for our PPP program, and taking it to Capitol Hill. And I'm so glad that those changes were made. It said there's more demand, there's more need. Some of the CARES Act funds that have been made available to municipalities and local governments to set up small business assistance programs did not work very well in last year. We have data that shows that so many minority businesses, again, did not get access to those resources at a comparable level to their non-minority peers. And you see differential outcomes in places like the Deep South that you'll see in Massachusetts or California because of the priorities of the elected officials in those regions. And so I really think it's important that advocacy, again, steps up and works with the federal government and state government to make sure there's accountability in how those federal resources, our tax dollars, are being used to support those businesses that are driving our economy.
Those responses are actually a great segue into our next questions, which are policy questions. I know earlier we referenced the Community Advantage Program. So one of our attendees is very involved with the credit union movement and referenced the fact that credit unions cannot access Community Advantage. Is there an equivalent approach, a 90% guarantee for credit unions, or what do we envision so that this important sector of lenders can participate in a similar way?
I'm a big fan of credit unions, and I had this fight across Treasury and basically with the banks. I would have to say without success, because to me, credit unions are fabulous on the ground, increasingly important small business lenders, and we need them. And we need them to be eligible for, all of these activities like Community Advantage. And there's no reason why they shouldn't be. I think this is, and I've said this to the Community Bankers Association, I'm also a big fan of community banks, but I think they have to stop fighting each other and get together and even let the fintechs join in, because they're all, I honestly think there's enough business for all of them. And that each one, we need each and every one of them. We need each and every one of them to be fully participating and to lean in and to stop, take their knives out of each other's throats and move forward.
Thank you. Hopefully we can leverage some of the momentum that was generated by the murder of George Floyd. We saw a tremendous shift in acknowledgement that systemic barriers exist in the economy and in the finance system, in the legal justice, criminal justice system. And we've seen businesses step up and do more than I've ever seen them do in the past to address diversity and inclusion. Maybe they can, some of the larger businesses, Business Roundtable, maybe even as they talk about implementing their purpose that an economy should work for all Americans, to get some of their bank members to make sure that credit unions are equipped to be a part of the solution in a more complete way.
So, Bill and Karen, we are approaching time for our closing remarks. Bill, one question that did come in, we'll pull some privilege here as the host. We had an engineer with a software, hardware design tech firm ask, how can I start a relationship with Hope to obtain capital?
If you're in the Deep South, We should have a branch not too far from you, but go to hopecu.org, and there you'll be able to find the person who covers your territory. We'd love to have the conversation.
Great. Again, thank you everyone for submitting questions. I think we are now going to move into closing remarks. Bill, Karen, be great. Any parting wisdom to share with the rest of our attendees?
Well, I'll just jump in because I like for Karen to have the last word. I just want to thank you again for the work you've done since I met you to close opportunity gaps facing the most underserved people and places. I always learn a lot when I'm with you. Today, you talked about helping businesses scaling CDFIs, unlocking the innovative capacity that's in these communities. And I hope your words go to the ears of policymakers and bankers and others who share the recognition of the importance of an economy that works for everyone. So Karen, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Bill, and to everybody at Hope. And also, I took a look at who was joining us today, and I don't know, it seems like a coalition of, terrific people from all corners of those who are interested in the Deep South and in small business. We need this economy to work for small businesses. We need it to work for Black-owned entrepreneurs of all kinds. And if we do, we can do what, America promises. We can give more access and opportunity. It won't be the only thing we need to do, but it is certainly something that I think is within the capacity of, of those institutions out there. And the urgency is now, especially as we come out of this such difficult time. We have to lean in every way, from shopping local to using local suppliers to opening up access and opportunity for capital, and also to having an ear open to that small business owner and just, keep the wind at their back, because that is what will make some of these disparities, be less relevant and maybe give some more opportunity to more people. And that would make, I think, all of us, be able to feel that we have made a difference.
Absolutely. The time is now. Absolutely. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. And thank you all for the work you do. It's really important.
Again, thank you, Karen. It's great to be here with you today. Bill, thank you. And thank you to all of our attendees for attending the forecast today. A recording of today's presentation will be made available for sharing for those who were not able to be with us. Once ready, we will announce its posting via email and on our social media channels. We would ask that you share it widely. Again, we appreciate you taking time to be with us today for this important conversation. Have a good rest of the day.